Rancher lived alone for years until he found a Bigfoot tribe trapped underground. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from today? And once the story is over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The wind swept hard across the open prairie, carrying the lonesome cry of a harmonica that seemed to drift straight out of memory. Hoofbeats echoed against the dry earth, red dust curling upward in the pale light of dawn, rolling down the trail toward a solitary ranch pressed against the edge of the wild. Samuel Carter had lived alone for years, but that morning when his lantern beam cut into the mouth of an abandoned shaft, the light didn't fall on stone. It fell on eyes. Dozens of them, staring back from the dark, eyes that did not blink, eyes that belonged to something waiting silent, hidden beneath the ground. And in that moment, unease tangled with curiosity, leaving only one question hanging in the cold air. Who were they? And why were they down there? The lonely man. High on the mountain plains of British Columbia, the land stretched wide and unforgiving. Endless silver grasslands ran headlong into the dark wall of pine, and beyond that snow-capped peaks stood watch like silent sentinels. The stillness here carried a weight of its own, heavy enough to swallow even the sound of a man's breath. The wind swept across the ranch yard dry as old bone curling dust into the air and setting the boards of the horse barn creaking. A lone wooden house stood against the wilderness, its chimney releasing only the thinnest ribbon of smoke before it vanished into cloud. This was the world of Samuel Carter, 60 years old, a rancher, a gun hand who had once ridden hard trails across a lifetime, now left to live alone at the edge of the timber. He patched his own fences, broke his own horses, and tended the soil with hands that remembered both work and war. Each day fell into the same quiet rhythm, dawn breaking without witness suppers eaten in silence, the saddle leather creaking under his weight, the echo of hoofbeats fading down trails no one else rode anymore. In that silence there was a kind of strength, but there was sorrow too, a hushed, unspoken sorrow. The shape of a man who had lost more than he'd ever managed to keep surviving winter after winter with only the wilderness to testify that he had lived at all. And so I'll ask you, if you had to spend your days alone on such a lonely ranch, far from every voice but the wind, what would you do? Part 1. The sound beneath the earth. Morning on the high plains of British Columbia carried a silence that felt heavier than stone. The sky broke pale blue frost still clinging to the brittle grass, while mountain crows called hoarsely from somewhere beyond the timber. Samuel Carter stood with his shoulders bent, calloused hands gripping a rusted hammer, driving iron nails into a fence post with slow, deliberate strokes. Each strike rang sharp across the empty pasture, echoing against the quiet, mingling with the sound of his own measured breath. For Samuel, this work was more than routine. It was ritual, a way of holding the boundary between his world and the wild, keeping out the deer, keeping out the wolves. He knew every strand of wire, every post, the way another man might know the lines of his own palm. But that morning, as he lifted his head to wipe the sweat from his brow, the wind dropped. The land grew still, and silence, unnatural pressing, spread over the fields. Then it came, a low sound, long, drawn out, rising from the direction of the canyon. It was not the bellow of cattle, nor the whistle of wind. It was deeper, resonant thrumming in his chest, like the string of a great unseen instrument being pulled too tight. Samuel froze, the hammer pausing midair. His gray eyes narrowed, fixing on the dark ridgeline across the valley. His heart struck harder against his ribs. In 30 years of mountain living, Samuel had heard it all: the wolf's cry tearing open the night, the roar of a bear tearing down prey in the pines, the panicked scream of a horse spooked by rattlesnakes. But this sound, this was different. It carried something older, something that felt like the earth itself was sighing. He stood listening, breath caught. Again the sound came longer, this time clearer, rolling up from beneath the ground, shivering through stone walls before fading into the morning air. His grip tightened on the hammer. A man like Samuel knew well when nature spoke in unfamiliar tones, it was either warning or secret. He raised his eyes toward the canyon. Cold air steamed from his lungs. Unease touched his heart, but curiosity flared hot against it. The feeling reminded him of the first time he'd heard gunfire carry across an open plain back when he rode with hired guns in his youth. Fear and exhilaration bound together. That was the moment of fracture. Half of him wanted to turn back to the safety of his cabin. The other half knew he had to walk into the dark and find the answer. Samuel brushed the dust from his wide-brimmed hat and settled it back on his head. His eyes glinted with a steady resolve. "There's something down there," he muttered, "and only one way to know what it is." The old hammer clattered against the fence post as he left it behind. He swung into the saddle of his dark bay gelding. The horse snorted, pawing at the dry ground, as if it too felt the pull of danger. Samuel steadied the reins and eased it down the forgotten trail toward the canyon. He had ridden this path 100 times in his life. He knew every tree, every stone. Once it had been a timber road, long abandoned, now scarred only by memories. He recalled young loggers firing pistols into the air to scatter bird storms of red dust sweeping the prairie until he was forced to camp beneath the pines for days at a time. But today, something was different. There were no birds, no deer crashing through brush. The forest was holding its breath. As the canyon walls loomed close, the sound rose again, louder, more haunting. Not the cry of a beast in pain, but a cadence, a rhythm born from deep within the earth itself. His horse halted, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. Samuel dismounted, boots crunching against stone. He stared into the shadowed cut of rock ahead where darkness pooled like water. He remembered old whispers from the saloon years ago, men claiming to hear roars beneath the snow, others swearing they'd seen giant silhouettes vanish in the teeth of a blizzard. Samuel had never believed them. He was a man of hard ground and fact. But now, the sound was here, and it was tearing holes in the walls of what he thought was true. In that moment, Samuel knew he was no longer just a bystander. Curiosity had carried him past the borders of safety. Each step forward was a gamble between reason and instinct. His hand brushed the grip of his revolver, a reflex burned into him after a lifetime of facing danger. But this time he sensed what waited ahead was not outlaw and not predator. His eyes held steady on the canyon, his lips pressed tight. "There's something out here," he whispered, "and it wants to be found." The canyon yawned open like the jaws of some old beast, hollow, dark, and waiting. Samuel tied his horse to a low pine, his calloused hand brushing its neck, leaving a gray streak of dust across its brown coat. The gelding snorted, ears pinned toward the mountain's hollow, as if it too could hear that ghostly call rising from within. The scent of pine sap and damp stone filled Samuel's lungs, stirring memories he thought long buried. The slope was rough, with loose rock. Samuel moved slow, every step measured. A twig cracked under his boot, sharp in the silence. On the ridge above, dry grass leaned aside to reveal old timber braces blackened by time and rain. Near the edge lay a broken sign, letters almost gone, "No entry." The kind of warning the wild often carved not in ink, but in fear. Then the sound came again. Not a single drawn-out note this time, but waves, low, rolling, layered, pulsing against the stone and fading back into silence. It was no wind, no water. It carried a breath. He froze, eyes fixed on the darkness below. His body leaned forward like a predator listening before it leaps. A gust swept the ridge, dragging a red haze of dust from the trail behind him. Dust he remembered clinging to his saddle in younger days, when he rode as a hired gun across cattle valleys. Storms had swept this prairie clean before erasing hoofprints in a single afternoon. Once gunfire had been the only language men believed in out here. Then a crack in the distance, sharp metallic fading across the western plain. A rifle shot. Not close, not aimed, but enough to remind Samuel that everything in this country had its price water land, even silence. The wind shifted. Grass bent low. Samuel's hand brushed the worn grip of his revolver, an old reflex. Then he let it fall. He wasn't here to fire. He was here to listen. At the lip of a broken shelf of rock, he spotted a furrow running down the slope like the mark of a spade ending in a cave-in below. Splintered timbers lay scattered, the bones of some forgotten mine. He knelt, lifted one rotten piece and flicked it with a thumb. It crumbled like charcoal. At the base of the incline, a hollow gaped black blind and dripping with moss that wept along its rim. A chill breathed from its depths, carrying the scent of stone, of wet fur, of something alive and hidden. It pulled him back to 19, stumbling into a bear's den in Montana, heart hammering against the thunder of its breath in the dark. The low sound rose again, closer now, sharper, like something exhaling deep in the earth. Samuel's loneliness met another loneliness then, older, darker, rooted in the stone beneath his boots. Curiosity cut at him like a blade slicing into the hardest part of his nature. He was not searching for danger. He simply could not live with a question left unanswered. Anyone down there. The words slipped free, so soft the wind didn't bother to carry them. The only reply was silence, a silence that pressed with weight. He stood, eyes locked on the pit. He knew if he turned back now, the sound would follow him forever, like a grain of sand caught in the eye, small but enough to blind a lifetime. Back at his horse, he gathered rope storm lantern and a narrow-bladed knife. Tools of survival, plain and practical, the kind every solitary rancher carried, something to bind, something to cut, something to light the dark. As he turned again toward the hollow, the ground trembled beneath his boots. Not much, just enough to feel like the heartbeat of something vast pulsing below the horizon. His horse reared, nostrils, flaring breath, blowing loud as a trumpet. And then the cattle came breaking loose from the valley below, rushing wild across the flats, dust rising into a thin red veil. Hooves thundered like war drums. A calf stumbled, rolled, then staggered back to its feet as if chased by the whole prairie itself. Samuel swung to the saddle. The horse leapt forward, and together they cut through the panic, his body low dust clawing at his face. He did not own this herd, but the law of the range was simple when cattle ran. A man on horseback turned the tide. At the herd's edge, he pressed close, raised his hand, and whistled sharp. The lead steer faltered, curved, and the others followed the stampede, widening, softening, then folding into a circle. Dust fell away. The storm of hooves slowed to a murmur. Out of the haze, a rider appeared, long coat hat, pulled, low eyes hollow with the weariness of the trail. He halted a short distance off, his gaze cutting from Samuel to the herd, with a look sharp enough to wound pride, but not draw blood. No thanks. Out here a man repaid kindness simply by not shooting you in the back. Whose stock? Samuel asked, voice flat as the plain. Kruger's, the stranger said, naming a rancher downriver. His glance lingered on Samuel, then on the ridge Samuel had descended from. Long enough to plant a question, short enough to deny he'd ever asked. Suspicion carried on the man's silence, cold as the wind through a general store door when all eyes turned to the loner standing inside. Samuel knew that look. The look a widower a man apart carried like a second shadow. In Wild West tales, that look often came just before fate arrived. By the time Samuel returned to the canyon, dusk had thickened. The sky deepened into velvet blue dust, streamed low like red smoke, and across the far prairie thin kitchen fires marked where families ate their suppers. Traded stories laughed softly. Here there was no fire, only Samuel, and the dark. He tested the lantern, the knife, the coil of rope. His left arm ached from the cattle drive but steadied still. The low sound pulsed again, steady as breath, not a threat, not a roar, but an invitation. The mind's mouth gaped like an old wound. Samuel cleared. Moss-shifted rotten boards tapped the ground with his boot. He dropped a stone. It fell for a long time before striking the faintest ping, rising up like a glass tapped by a fingertip. He anchored the rope to a pine rooted deep in stone, one end around his waist. The lantern fastened at his back, its glow painting a thin gold ribbon down his arm. Cold crept up his legs, warning, pressing, but he ignored it. The smell hit him first. Damp stone, rusted iron, and something else, animal musk, sharp and raw like a storm gathering in the bones of the earth. He lowered the lantern. Light skimmed stone walls, glinting off long, ragged claw marks etched into the rock. A clump of dark hair clung to splintered timber. Samuel touched it gently. It was damp, soft, and thick with musk. His heart beat a different rhythm, then not fear but certainty. Life waited below. From the depths came the sound again, this time short, deliberate. Not a growl, not a cry, but an answer. Samuel understood this was no passing curiosity. This was a crossing. One side held his cabin, his cold supper. The other, an unwritten story. He tested the rope. The lantern shook its glow, trembling on the stone like a flag unseen. He leaned into the darkness, rope tight against his weight. For a breath, he paused, lifting his eyes to the fading sky. And then he heard it. Not a plea, not a threat. A sound like waiting. His loneliness suddenly had shape. It was no longer the silence of an empty house. It was something vast and ancient rising out of the earth, reaching to meet him. Samuel pulled himself back. Not from fear, but because he knew once he went down, he would not return the same. He coiled the rope, set it by the lantern and knife. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow, when his body was rested, when his mind had chosen. Out here, the best stories always left space for the pause before destiny. At the canyon's edge, he stopped listening. The wind had died. Dust lay still. The sky turned deep purple, the forest holding its breath. Somewhere a hawk cried once like punctuation, and Samuel felt lighter, as though the dark had not held him back but promised, "I'll wait." Back at the horse, he felt its warm muzzle press against his shoulder. He gave it a slow pat, a rare smile hidden beneath his graying mustache meant only for himself. Before leaving the canyon, he turned, whispered into the night tomorrow. He rode slow across the thinning plain. Far ahead, ranch lights winked like scattered embers across a blanket of night. Men in those homes would count cattle, clean guns, share market tales, then sleep. Samuel carried something else home, an untitled sound from the earth. In town, if he ever spoke of it, men would laugh, doubt, or worse, follow with loaded rifles. But the wilderness needed no witnesses. Its stories lived in the silence, waiting for men patient enough to stand at the edge of darkness and choose to enter. And so I'll ask you, if you stood where Samuel stood tonight, one step from the pit, one step from the unknown, would you go down now or wait for dawn? Part 2. The Hidden Shaft. The forest night sank deep into Samuel's skin, cold enough to make his joints crack whenever he clenched his fists. The moon had not yet risen. The sky was a heavy dark, pierced only by a few faint stars flickering like distant lanterns over some faraway town. Samuel stood at the edge of the shaft, his eyes as still as the timberline, his hands knotting rope around the roots of an old pine. The roots curled through stone like arms, locked in a permanent embrace strong enough to bear the weight of a man and the weight of his reckless choice. He tugged the rope, listened to it strain, its rasping creak like the breath of an old horse in winter. He gave a firm nod, tying an extra knot. A man who lived alone couldn't afford mistakes. A careless rope was as good as a grave. The storm lantern flickered to life, its golden glow trembling in the night wind. As Samuel leaned forward, his shadow stretched across the mouth of the shaft, bent and distorted like some other figure waiting for him below. A chill rose from the opening, sharp with the smell of damp earth, rotted timber, and something acrid, half like wet fur, half like rusted iron. Samuel drew a breath that seemed to swell tight in his chest. Before climbing down, his palm rested on the worn grip of his revolver, cold, certain. From the days he'd ridden as a cattle guard across the ranges, one lesson had never left him in the West. A man never walked into the dark without a gun. It had once saved him when a sandstorm masked the approach of rustlers. He swung his legs over the edge. The rope rasped against his boots, his body lowered into blackness, lantern swaying against his hip. Stone pressed cool against his shoulders. Damp air climbed his face. Droplets fell from moss above, sliding down his collar. Each heartbeat echoed like a drum roll inside the hollow. Several fathoms down, the sound rose again. Not wind, not falling rock. Low, short. A sigh too deep for any ordinary creature. Samuel froze, suspended in the shaft, heart hammering faster. He had lived a life of solitude, but here inside the earth he knew he was no longer alone. His boots met bottom. The ground gave slightly wet with mud. Samuel unfastened the lantern from his belt, raising it high. Its light fought the dark, chasing shadows across stone walls dripping with water. Old timbers jutted overhead like broken ribs of some long-dead beast. He moved forward. Each step fell with a hollow thud, the echoes answering back like the mine itself had a voice. A strange draft swept across his face. Samuel stopped the lantern, swaying its beam, cutting ahead, and he froze. There within the black wall, eyes gleamed. One pair, then two, then five, then dozens, at different heights, all unmoving, all fixed on him. The lantern's glow shone in them, amber mixed with green like glass stained with fire. Shapes stood behind the ruined timbers, massive forms furred and thick, motionless as stone. They did not roar. They did not charge. They only watched. Samuel's hand tightened on the revolver. His palm was slick with sweat. He did not draw. He did not release. Something deep inside told him they were no mere beasts. His breath echoed through the chamber, ragged and loud as winter wind through cabin doors. Theirs answered back slow, steady, deep, as though some great drumbeat rose from the floor itself. The earth trembled faintly with each exhale. He lowered the lantern's beam to the ground, not into their eyes. For an instant, the light caught shoulders broad, as oxen arms that hung to the knee fur, tangled thick, the silhouettes of giants interwoven like shadows on stone. Some smaller chest-high to him, but of the same kind. All still, all waiting. A memory stirred in him of cattle once bunched tight in a storm, eyes fixed in one direction, not fleeing, only waiting for the signal. And here, too, these creatures waited. Samuel knew one wrong move, and the dark would fall upon him like a pack of wolves. But he also knew, if he held steady, he stood at the threshold of something no man had ever witnessed. His throat worked dry. He edged back half a step. His shadow stretched long across the wall, small, frail, alone, facing a tribe of giants. And in that moment, truth struck hard. He, one old man, was standing before a people, a tribe. The night air seeped into Samuel's bones, so cold his knuckles cracked each time he tightened his grip. The moon had not risen, and the sky was heavy with dark, only a scatter of pale stars flickering above like the far-off lamps of a distant town. He stood at the shaft's edge, eyes steady as the timberline rope in his hands. He knotted it around the roots of an old pine. The roots clung to stone like arms, locked forever, strong enough to carry the weight of a man and of his reckless decision. Samuel tugged. The rope strained, groaning like the breath of an old horse in winter. He tied another knot. A man living alone had no margin for error. A careless knot could cost him his life. The lantern flared to life, its gold light shivering against the wind. As he leaned down, his shadow stretched across the shaft's mouth, warped and waiting like another figure watching from below. Cold air rose to meet him, thick with the smell of wet stone-rotted timber and something sharper, half the musk of wild hide, half the tang of old iron. Samuel drew the breath deep, his chest tightening. His palm lingered on the revolver at his side, metal cold solid. From his years riding cattle guard, one truth had never left him in the West. No man walked into darkness without a gun. He lowered himself over the rim. Rope rasped against his boots, the lantern swinging at his hip. The stone walls brushed his shoulders, damp air pressed against his face. Water dripped from moss above, sliding under his collar. His heart thundered loud in the hollow, every beat like a drum announcing him. Midway down, the sound rose again, not wind, not falling stone. Low, brief. A sigh too vast for any creature he'd known. Samuel hung motionless in the shaft, his heart beating harder. A life lived alone had taught him much. But here in the belly of the earth, he knew he was no longer alone. His boots sank into mud at the bottom. He unfastened the lantern, raising it high. Light crawled across the chamber, painting wet stone and rotten beams that hung broken like the ribs of something long dead. He stepped forward. Each bootfall echoed back as though the mine itself was answering. Then a draft brushed his face. Samuel froze, lantern trembling. Its light fell across the dark, and he stopped cold. Eyes. One pair, then two, then five, then dozens. At different heights, all unmoving, all locked on him. The lantern's glow reflected in them, amber tinged with green like glass lit by hidden fire. Behind shattered beams, enormous figures stood cloaked in fur, still as statues. They did not roar, they did not charge, they only watched. Samuel's hand clenched the revolver, his palm slicked with sweat. He neither drew nor let go. His gut told him they were no wild beasts. His breath rattled loud in the silence like winter wind, howling through a cabin door. Theirs came back deep and steady, a slow rhythm that seemed to rise from the stone itself, each exhale making the ground beneath him tremble. He lowered the lantern, no longer shining into their eyes. The light brushed across broad shoulders, arms long enough to near the knees for tangled, thick bodies overlapping in shadow. Some smaller, no taller than his chest, but alike in every way, all waiting. And Samuel felt something stir within him. It was the same as that night long ago, when a sandstorm drove his herd into panic. The cattle did not scatter wild. They bunched together, eyes fixed, waiting for a signal. These beings too were waiting. He understood then, one wrong move, and the dark would break loose upon him like a pack of wolves. But if he kept still, if he held steady, he was standing before something no man had ever seen. His throat was dry. He stepped back half a pace. The lantern cast his shadow small and solitary against the stone, facing down a whole tribe of giants. And in that moment, truth struck him like a hammer. He, one old man, was standing before a people, a tribe. Part 3. The Buried Truth. Samuel lowered the storm lantern close to the damp floor. Its yellow glow wavered across the stone, throwing his shadow long and misshapen, a frail figure among giants that did not move. The chamber held its breath. Only the drip of water from the ceiling and the deep, steady respiration of those surrounding him filled the silence. He had lived with silence before forest silence, the restless wind across prairie grass, the thunder of cattle breaking loose when lightning split the sky. But this silence was different. It carried memory. It carried weight, like a tomb that had guarded its secret for 1,000 years. Those eyes staring back at him were not savage. They were not the desperate eyes of an animal cornered. They measured, they considered. They spoke to each other in low vibrations, tones that were not growls, but language. Samuel listened. He had once heard cows call for their calves in a sandstorm, horses cry out for their herd after a long night, cowboys sound the alarm with a bugle across the range. He knew the difference between fear and the call of kin. And what he heard now, short resonant notes passed back and forth, was nothing less than a conversation. The lantern swept higher, catching a wall of collapsed rock and broken beams. The old tunnel was sealed tight. No passage, no escape. Samuel's chest thudded. They weren't down here by choice. They were trapped. Not one, but a whole tribe. The flickering light revealed a figure stooped with age, fur gone white in patches, shoulders, rounded eyes, weary. Beside it stood a smaller shape, no taller than Samuel's chest, half hidden behind its mother's leg. The sight struck him with a memory of calves huddling behind their mothers when dust storms swallowed the range. And in that moment, Samuel no longer saw monsters. He saw a family, a people, entombed in stone, robbed of sky, living out their days in darkness. And he, an old man in a wooden shack bound by solitude and memory, saw himself in them. Prisoners all the same. His breath grew heavy. He leaned back against the wet rock, closing his eyes. Darkness swelled inside him, bringing back an old memory, his 20th year, a storm on the prairie. The sky had turned black, the wind screaming, a herd of cattle pounding in panic. Shots cracked as riders fired into the air, desperate to steady the herd. It did no good. Through the chaos, Samuel remembered one calf separated, wild-eyed, about to vanish beneath a tide of red dust. He'd driven his horse straight into the maelstrom, dropped his loop, and hauled it back. He hadn't thought. He'd only known if he didn't act, it would die. Tonight, in the belly of the earth, that memory returned. The rumbling voices of this hidden tribe were no different than the calls of cattle for their young. And the eyes watching him now were not the eyes of predators. They were the eyes of a people waiting for deliverance. Samuel opened his eyes. Dozens of pairs still held him in their gaze, not lunging, not fleeing, waiting like a herd in the storm, watching for the man who would cut the current. His hand trembled against his chest, feeling the gallop of his heart. Instinct urged him to climb the rope, leave it all behind. But something deeper spoke louder, the same thing that once drove him to save a calf, that once set him against rustlers on a midnight trail. That voice whispered now, "You cannot walk away." In those eyes, Samuel saw no menace. He saw his own loneliness, his own hunger for freedom reflected back at him. And so he nodded just once, a nod so small it might have been missed. But in his heart it carried the weight of a vow, "I'll find a way." Samuel lowered the storm lantern even closer to the wet stone, its amber glow washing across the ground like a thin coat of paint. Moss swelled gently with an unseen breath. Rivulets of water traced silver lines across the rock. He neither stepped forward nor back. His whole body sank into a single act, listening. From the right one of the larger figures shifted broad shoulders, turning slow to shield a smaller one pressed tight behind it. Not the motion of a hunter, the motion of a guardian. Another aged fur, silvered in patches, sat slumped against a fallen beam, eyes dim yet not extinguished. At the far corners, two stood like sentinels, their chests rising and falling in unison. Every breath was a reminder we are here together. Samuel crouched, pressing his fingertips to the earth. The mud bore countless tracks, not hooves, but wide impressions, long and heavy. Some deep, some faint, circling, pausing. A record of living. Not the lair of creatures skulking in fear, but the dwelling of a people sealed in stone. On the walls, crude etchings cut with sharp rock circles, slashes lines broken where the cave had collapsed. He ran his fingers across them. The edges were cold sharp. Something here had ended long ago. He shifted the lantern left. A small cairn of rocks stood stacked with deliberate hands shaped into an arrow pointing toward the caved-in tunnel. Not accident, not play. A sign, the kind of language older than words, the kind carried in old native tales, scratched onto canyon walls and riverbanks long before letters were known. Man and not man alike had always used marks when words could not cross. Then came the sound, low, warm, like a drum buried deep in earth. From every corner, voices answered, layered, brief. Not alarm, not command, only recognition, "We know you are here." Samuel pulled off his glove, lifted his bare hand palm outward. It was all he had to offer. The lantern threw his rough fingers across the wall, trembling like stirrup leather in the wind. A younger figure tilted its head, eyes flickering with a question. From the chest of the largest came a single deep note, steady as a father telling a child to stay. In the frozen dark, Samuel understood silence was the only true language here. He no longer saw them as threats. He saw the order of a family. His own solitude, the empty suppers, the cold wind slipping beneath the cabin roof suddenly felt less heavy. For here beneath the earth were beings who had lived with silence far longer than he and carried it with the discipline of kinship. He drew from his pocket a strip of dried meat, the ration of every trail rider. He placed it on the ground, not pushed toward them, not offered to a hand, just left. Another mark, a sign that sharing didn't always mean demand. No one lunged for it. In time, an older one slipped forward, sniffed, and left it untouched. Restraint. Samuel nodded once. They had rules. He raised the lantern toward the blocked passage. Earth and stone pressed tight, beams splintered across rusted nails, jutting like blackened teeth. No breaking through from inside. Force here would bring the whole ceiling down. The only chance lay above, widen the shaft-cut footholds, lead them one by one, smaller, first larger, after like driving calves through a rocky pass in spring flood. Already his mind lined the tools in silence, crowbar, folding spade, hammer, rope, and pulley stakes, hatchet for roots. He saw his shoulders, aching hands torn raw, his back seizing with lactic fire. He heard stone collapsing, the crash echoing through the valley. But above all, he saw their eyes steady, waiting, placing in him a hope they had never given to another. And for a man of the West, hope placed upon your shoulders was harder to refuse than a gun pressed to your ribs. The giant in the center shifted. Not fast, not loud, just a movement slow as a mountain loosening. Its head nearly brushed the beams above shoulders, scraping wood with a soft rasp. It stopped 3 strides away. The lantern's circle barely held them both now, one towering, one small. Samuel's hands stayed loose at his sides, palms open. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, keeping his gaze from a direct challenge. The musk mixed with damp earth grew thicker, wrapping around him like an old blanket. At this distance, he saw the scars across its chest, pale lines of battles past the singed edges of fur, as though fire had once swept this tunnel. On its wrist, thick calluses like those of a miner's hand, proof of years spent pushing, pulling, digging against the unyielding wall. Its eyes held no malice. They were old and awake. They measured him not as prey, but as a partner without words. From its chest came 3 notes low, even like the measured knock of a stick on a barrel bum. Bum, bum. Voices from the shadows echoed back, shorter, softer. Samuel could not know the meaning, but he felt the intent greeting. Recognition. He answered the only way he could. With his free hand, he tapped the lantern's handle. Talk, talk, talk. Barely audible, yet enough to share a rhythm. The giant tilted its head, eyes lowering a fraction, then rising again as if weighing and returning a decision. Slowly, with purpose, it drew a line in the earth. Another. The 2 crossing into an X. Its hand rested at the center for a beat. Samuel held his breath. On the damp floor, the X glowed faint in lantern light, a knot binding them both to something unspoken. Memories rushed, stories of the frontier travelers leaving crossed sticks for rescue herds marked with X on fence posts, survivors chalking X on cabin doors after the storm to say we are still here. It was not warning. It was acknowledgement. No words yet. Samuel understood. You see me. I see you. From here, a line we share. Then, far above, a rifle cracked sharp and sudden. Crack. The sound punched through the ground and was gone. None of them moved. Their discipline sent chills over his skin, not from fear, but respect. In that thin moment, Samuel realized the climax of the night was not in attack or retreat. It was in what did not happen. No charge, no collapse, no roar. Only an X in the dirt and a gaze as long as a lifetime. The giant withdrew its hand, stood tall. It never turned its back, only eased 1 step away. Around the chamber, others shifted like a ripple, clearing a path toward the shaft where Samuel's rope hung black and coiled. A corridor. They understood. He would leave. He would return. For the first time in many years, Samuel felt trust placed on him not by men but by beings with no reason to give it. The weight of it straightened his back. He bent, lifted the lantern. Its glow fell across the X, glowing faint, like a sunbeam lost to the bottom of a well. He let his eyes linger on theirs, no words spoken. In the West, the truest promise was often the one left unsaid. He backed toward the rope lantern in one hand, the line in the other, moving with the solemnity of ritual. No quick turns, no sudden gestures. At the rim, he nodded once, slow, complete. The giant bowed its head a fraction in return. The covenant was sealed. His climb tore fire through his shoulders, grit, cutting his hands, his lungs raw with the taste of earth. At the mouth, the night rushed him sharp with pine and grass. He set the lantern in the wet grass, coiled the rope, kneed a sleeping serpent at his feet. The sky was nailed thick with stars, the air carrying the bite of coming rain. He glanced down, only blackness. But he knew what lay there. The X, the eyes, the silence that now bound him. He broke 2 twigs, laid them in a small X at the rim. A mark for himself, a mark for them. He whispered a tally, crowbar, hammer, folding spade pulley, spare rope stakes, thick gloves, water, extra oil. His old cowhand's mind had slipped into work. Work was how a man lived through the dramas of the West. He led the horse across the dew-soaked plain. At the edge of the field, a rider sat on a black horse beneath low clouds. The stranger from earlier or another. The glance they shared cut brief and sharp, tinged with frontier suspicion. "What were you doing in the mountains, old man?" Samuel gave only a tilt of his chin, kept riding. Out here, some things stayed whole only if left unspoken. Far off, a cattle bell chimed faint. Another gunshot cracked the night, then silence. Dust rose even in damp air, curling thin behind his horse's hooves like old memory that refused to settle. Samuel's chest felt lighter once a road is chosen. Fear becomes simply the work ahead. At the ranch, he set his gear on the table knife lantern rope. From a cabinet, he drew a wrinkled scrap of paper, writing in blunt letters, "Tomorrow open the shaft." Beneath it, he drew an X. The ink pooled dark at the crossing. He stared long, folded it, and slid it into his pocket like a talisman. Outside, the wind rattled the barn door, sounding like a harmonica gone off key. Samuel lit the stove. Pine resin smoked warm in the cabin air. He did not eat. He sat staring through the window. At the edge of the trees, eyes or only imagination gleamed, then slipped back into dark. Not a threat, just present. In the hush of firelight, Samuel understood all those years he thought he was a man living at the edge of life's story. Tonight, under the earth among the marks of an X, he belonged to something larger. No trumpets, no names, just a man preparing to do his part when the sun returned. He blew the lantern out. Darkness settled. Beyond the cabin, the sky thickened with rain. And at dawn, he would ride back an old man with worn hands, stubborn as the mountains, and if God willed it, strong enough to carve a way out. If you were Samuel, having seen that X scratched into the earth, having heard the breath of a buried tribe, what would you do come morning? Call for help, risking the town's suspicion, or return alone, keeping faith with a promise unspoken? Part 4. The rescue dawn had not yet broken. Silver fog still clung to the peaks and beads of water hung on the wild grass when Samuel led his horse out to the open ground. He loaded its back heavy with iron and labor crowbar, hatchet folding spade coils of rope, storm lantern water, a bag of dried meat. For a man of 60, even tying down the weight was enough to raise cords in his forearms, but he did not hesitate. The trail to the canyon lay cold and damp, like a throat of stone swallowing the morning light. When he reached it, the wind hissed through the walls. Fence posts rattled faint on the far range, and from beyond the valley came the faint crack of a rifle echoing from town like a reminder of suspicion still alive. Samuel stood a long moment staring at the shaft's mouth, where his X of broken twigs remained intact, soaked in dew. Then he began. The crowbar struck stone, each blow booming down into the shaft like a drumbeat. Earth shook loose, dust rose with the sour scent of rust and wet clay. Roots curled like gray snakes across the opening. He cut them with his knife sap, bleeding sharp and bitter. Sweat ran in black streaks down his face, mixing with dirt. Now and again he stopped, leaning his back against the wall, eyes lifted to the sky, slowly turning amber. From the distance another shot rang, lonely, distrustful. But here it was only him, the stone, and the promise he had made without words. Each heave loosed another slab, tumbling into the canyon like bulls panting after the drive. His arms trembled, but his eyes stayed bright. He remembered the storms on the open plain, cattle panicked, lungs burning, eyes stinging with dust. You did not choose then. You endured. You held until it was done. By the time the first sun touched the ridgeline, the opening had widened, narrow but open. Samuel dropped the spade and waited. From below, dozens of eyes lit faintly in the dark once more. A single note rose low, deep, and fell silent. Then came the scrape of stone, the shift of weight. Samuel uncoiled the rope and let it drop. The first shadow appeared, a small one, fur-thin frame slight. It looked up, eyes flickering gold with hesitation. Samuel nodded, pointing to the rope. The little body trembled, then clutched it. The line drew taut. Samuel's arms clenched, fire racing through his shoulders. He hauled inch by inch, breath, hissing, gloves burning against the rope. At last, the head emerged, panting, hands clutching earth. Samuel braced a knee, reached down, and offered his calloused palm. For a heartbeat, the young one stared. Then, with a shudder, it placed its furred hand in his. Samuel pulled hard, and it tumbled free onto the wet grass. No roar, no triumph, only life returned to the sky. From below, a voice answered louder, deeper, like a call of acknowledgement. In the dark, an elder lifted its head, eyes blazing. Samuel knew they had seen. They believed. Another climbed. Then two. Then four. Each time Samuel strained his back near breaking the lip of the earth, weakening under the weight. Sweat and dirt coursed down his jaw, but each hand that gripped his was another he could not abandon. Then came one of the great ones. It did not take the rope. It heaved its own body up the earth, trembling under its bulk. Samuel lunged with the crowbar, prying a stone aside, opening one more handhold. With a surge, the giant burst through chest-heaving skin, damp with sweat. It straightened nearly twice Samuel's height, then bowed its head low, an old gesture of respect, before turning and vanishing into the pines. One by one the tribe emerged, silent, patient, and vanished into the forest of mourning. Not one looked back, yet Samuel felt the pull of them, a cord, invisible, binding him to their departure. The sun climbed high and then seemed to stop, hanging still like a broken clock. Stone around the shaft mouth grew hot, the resin of pine bled sharp in the air, mingling with rust and sweat. Samuel stripped off his coat, wedged it across the rim to shield loose earth from spilling back down. He drove 2 stakes into the edge, wrapped the rope across them, each knot tied hard as a silent vow. The crowbar rang again, clang, 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 patient, relentless. Each stone pried loose. Samuel shoved aside with the toe of his boot, the way a man urges a stubborn calf through a gate in the rain. Sweat rolled down his neck, mixing with dirt into a thin paste of mud. Above, the wind shifted. It tore across the grasslands in a sudden strip of dust, like a miniature sandstorm, flaring and dying, leaving only the taste of scorched earth on his tongue. From the far valley, a herd broke into noise bells, clanging hooves pounding, then faded like a sea closing over itself. Samuel froze at the sound of nearer hooves. A rider emerged on the ridge, long coat, hat brim pulled low, a black horse steaming in the sun. The stranger reined in 20 yards away, gaze sweeping over the scattered tools, the raw shaft mouth, the makeshift cover Samuel had rigged. Then that look returned to Samuel's face, cold, thin frontier suspicion. "What in God's name are you doing here?" Samuel didn't answer. In the West, words were cheaper than dust. Only deeds carried weight. He lifted his chin once barely. The rider sat still, hand resting where a gun could be. Then a single rifle shot cracked from the far hills, sharp and hollow. The black horse started, but the rider didn't flinch. A moment's silence. Then he wheeled his mount, fading into distance, dust trailing like smoke. Samuel never watched him go. He knew the law here, a man's eyes could drive you off quicker than his gun. And rumors moved faster than wind. The crowbar struck again. Another slab gave way. The hole yawned wider like a wound refusing to heal. From below, low notes rumbled up steady and deep like oars dipping inside a dark cavern. Samuel answered with his hardest blow yet. A chunk of rock split loose. Sunlight pierced deeper. He dropped the rope. "Climb," he said softly, as if urging a skittish calf across a wooden bridge. The next one was not small. Its hand wrapped around the rope, the weight fell heavy, wet sack heavy. Rope squealed, stakes shivered. Samuel lashed the line to his saddle horn, braced his boots, and leaned back with all his weight. The horse snorted, stepped and obeyed the silent command, turning man and animal into a poor man's pulley. The body rose inch by inch, each inch a battle stone, crumbling roots, snapping rope, burning hot through leather. Samuel's chest thundered like a war drum from cattle raids long ago. His glove tore, blood spilled. He did not let go. At last, the shoulders broke daylight. Samuel seized the thick arm, yanked hard, and the creature toppled onto the wet grass. It did not roar. It only bowed deep and low, then turned into the trees. And then the largest came, the one that filled the shaft to bursting. Samuel widened the edges, chopped roots until his arms screamed fire. When the giant's shoulders jammed, he shifted angles, braced, barked orders, half to himself, half to the beast. "Turn your shoulder. That's it. Easy. Now push." The horse dug deep veins, straining. Dust stormed in a whirl, and through it, Samuel saw one eye, dark, calm, unflinching. Then, with a final surge, the giant broke free. It knelt, pressed one knee to the earth, lifted its face to the gray sky like a man at prayer. When it rose to full height, Samuel's instinct made him step back half a pace. The forest was waiting. The tribe, silent shadowed, emerged from between the trees, forming a loose arc. The giant moved past Samuel's slow-scarred shoulders, carrying the weight of winters gone. It did not touch him. It did not speak. Yet the air it left behind was so still that even birds above held their breath. One by one they filed into the pines. No branch snapped. No grass broke. Only silence. One young one paused by Samuel's horse, sniffing the rope that still smelled of struggle. The horse did not flinch. The young one looked at Samuel once, brief, wordless, and slipped away. At the tree line, the giant turned its head. Eyes met Samuel's. No debt, no demand, only dignity. The dignity of those who carry burdens without complaint. It bowed, small, solemn, then vanished into the wild. When the last shadow melted, sound returned, cattle bells faint across the plain, another rifle shot cracking from the opposite ridge, the wind sweeping across grass to touch the raw wound of the shaft like a benediction. Samuel stood a long time. The ground bore their footprints wide and deep, shining with water before fading. His horse cropped grass steady. Samuel studied his torn hand stinging sweet with blood and grit. He bound the rope, pulled the stakes, laid the coat back across the opening to keep the rain out. Then he looked toward the forest, nodded once, heavier, now laden with meaning. By sunset, another rider came. Gray coat, dun horse. He stopped far off, staring long stare sharp enough to dig for truth in the soil. Samuel did not move. Out here, tales were told at markets in voices too loud, but the real stories stayed buried, known only to those who had the silence to hold them. The rider turned away, dust trailing like rumor. Samuel mounted when the sun laid its hand on the ridge. His horse stepped steady hooves, tapping time with the calmer beat of his chest. Storm clouds gathered at the horizon, but behind him, a way out had been opened. There are moments when a man grows old in a single breath, and moments when he grows young again in the same breath. That day, Samuel felt both. And if you had been standing beside him, shaft open, tribe gone, only forest whispering and footprints fading, would you have kept this secret for yourself? Or carried it back to town to face every doubting eye waiting there? Tell me, what would you have done? Part 5. The Wordless Message. The horizon bled red as the sun pressed low, spilling its last light across gray clouds. Samuel had nearly finished clearing the tools from the shaft's edge. He crouched down, lit the final cigarette left in his worn leather pouch, the harsh smoke mingling with sweat and the damp scent of earth. His horse grazed quietly nearby, so calm it seemed as if the long day had been nothing but a dream. He thought it was over. The tribe had vanished into the forest. The shaft lay empty, and only his own tracks remained. But then from deep within the timber came the sharp snap of a branch. His horse's head shot up ears, stiff, snorting uneasily. Samuel tilted his head, instincts honed on the frontier, sending his hand straight to the revolver's grip. In the stillness, the metallic click of the hammer sounded loud as a church bell at midnight. And then they stepped out. 3 shadows emerged from the trees, the towering leader in front, and behind him, 2 younger figures, slighter, their eyes still carrying the spark of curiosity, not yet dulled by hardship. In the leader's hand was a broken branch shaped into a crude X. In the dying light, the split in the wood glimmered pale silver against his dark furred frame. Samuel's chest tightened. He hadn't expected them to return, let alone to bring something. The leader's amber eyes locked with his across the dust-red glow of dusk. No threat, no warmth either. Just a weighty presence, as if the land itself had chosen this moment to speak without words. The leader advanced each step like a hammer, striking earth, making the weeds bow and the ground tremble. Samuel rose, his hand still on the gun, but his gaze steady. He had stared down men who killed without reason, faced stampedes under lightning, and seen sandstorms bury horses alive. Yet the calm gravity of the creature before him shook him more than any of those memories. Only a few paces away, the leader stopped. Slowly he crouched and laid the branch shaped like an X at the toes of Samuel's dust-worn boots. The gesture wasn't cautious nor rushed. It carried the solemnity of laying a cross on a grave or of a gunfighter driving his blade into a tree after a duel. The two young ones behind watched intently, their eyes reflecting the dying ember of Samuel's cigarette. No growls, no bared teeth, just silence. And the forest itself followed suit, no bird call, no wind. Samuel bent down. His calloused fingers brushed the broken wood rough, still damp with resin, its jagged split forming a clean X. He lifted his gaze. The leader's eyes still fixed on him, deep still, like the night about to fall. And in them Samuel read something unexpected. Not gratitude, not warning. Acceptance. On the frontier, acceptance was worth more than gold. It meant, you belong, if only in our memory. A flicker passed through him. He recalled walking into saloons back in town, receiving nothing but wary glances from ranch hands and horse traders. To them, he was just an old man wasting away on a barren ranch, a shadow of a life once lived. But here before these towering figures, Samuel, for the first time in years, felt truly acknowledged. His breath caught tight in his chest. Slowly he nodded. He spoke no words. He didn't need to. And that was enough. The wind swept across the prairie, carrying a thin veil of rose-colored dust. On the wet grass, the X of broken branches lay before Samuel's boot, clean, sharp, and wild in its simplicity. The leader did not speak, of course, but his breathing carried rhythm, low and steady like stone drums rumbling from the earth. Behind him, the two younger figures tilted their heads, amber eyes glinting in the dusk, waiting for a signal. Samuel slowly unfastened a spare rein from his saddle, coiling it into a loop. He set it across the branch X, forming a knot at the center, like the way cowboys once marked rendezvous points out on empty ground. In this country where words were too easily twisted, signs spoke stronger than guns. The leader inclined his head. His thick furred hand lowered slowly, fingertips tapping 3 times against the soil. Thump, thump, thump. Deep in his chest came 3 answering rumbles, short, steady, boom, boom, boom. The two young ones echoed each note softer, lighter. A ritual, a confirmation. Samuel pressed a palm against his worn chest over his tired heart, then touched that same hand to the X's center. He did not bow too low nor stand too rigid, an old frontier gesture of respect, the kind men once gave each other around a campfire. The leader answered with a half-step forward so slight it might have gone unseen, yet enough to close the invisible gulf between man and not man. The valley wind carried the tang of rust and wood smoke. Somewhere far off, a third gunshot cracked dry, then faded like a period closing the story the town told itself. In the hush that followed, the faint whine of a harmonica drifted across the distance, thin, warped, yet enough to stir Samuel's memory of old Western romances, man with land, with horse, with silence. The two younger ones stepped forward. Each carried half of a spare branch, fitting them together into a smaller X and laying it beside the first. They stared long at Samuel, unblinking. In their eyes he read the question, "What are we to each other across this border?" Samuel plucked a thin strip of leather from his hat band, tying the 2 X's at their centers with a plain, firm knot. "So the wind won't scatter them," he murmured. Words they could not understand, but perhaps the meaning carried. The low rumbles in the leader's chest softened. Peace seeped in fine as mist. And as the knot tightened, Samuel understood what he had never admitted in all his years. He still longed to belong to something, even if that something bore no human face. Among all the tales told of friendship and loyalty, this was a story of signs of breath and of trust without signatures. They did not leave at once. The leader turned, slightly gesturing toward 3 tall pines at the clearing's edge. The young ones stepped forward, scraping faint X's into the bark with a broken twig, shallow cuts, leaving no sap to bleed. 3 marks formed a silent triangle, encircling the shaft boundary posts, not meant for men. In that instant, the forest changed its voice. Leaves hushed. Birds held back their calls. Down the slope, a cattle herd shivered mid-rush as if meeting a crosswind. Samuel stood still, feeling the chill settle down his back, cool and clean like well water poured across sunburned skin. A fox slipped from low brush, sniffed and vanished. Above, a hawk circled without a cry. The leader growled faintly, not a threat, but like the land itself pronounced by its true name. Life around them heard, understood, and yielded. Samuel knew from this moment the borders of his ranch were redrawn, not with barbed wire, but with an unwritten pact. From the trail came hoofbeats, fast, sharp. 2 young ranch hands galloped across the clearing. They saw Samuel by the shaft, saw the tools, saw the branch X. Suspicion flared like a flicked knife. One jerked his reins, about to wheel away, but the other gripped his sleeve, gave the slightest shake of the head. They rode on without a word. In this country, what you don't know is often best left unasked. The wind dragged a thin blade of dust across the grass, hast, hast, hast. Smoke from distant kitchens curled above the valley. Samuel felt the shift in his bones. The territory had edged outward one step further, though the town would never know, even living beside it. The leader closed the last pace to Samuel. No lowering, no puffing of chest smooth as a log sliding across still water. He laid his wide hand over the X, pressing one finger to the knot Samuel had tied. Held it a moment, then lifted that hand to his own chest. The rumble within him changed key from wary to calm, a promise wordless. Samuel drew a long breath, the damp earth sweet as childhood candy. He laid his hand on his chest and nodded. At the edge of his eyes, water welled and fell back, not falling. Men of the West seldom cried. They did. Sometimes in the best Wild West stories, a climax arrives with an embrace or a handshake. Here there was no touch, only 2 hands resting on 2 chests, 2 pairs of eyes holding each other, and 3 carved X's left for the wind to read. They departed as they had come, silent. The leader turned, first the young ones lifting their spare branch to carry with them. Their silhouettes slipped across the grass, vanishing into the trees against the sun's retreat. When the last shadow melted away, the world opened its sound again. Crickets by the stream, the jingle of distant cattle bells, the faint creak of leather on Samuel's saddle. He stood for a long while. On the ground, the twin X's bound with his leather strip lay like a charm someone had placed at his door. Samuel gathered his tools, covered the shaft, slung the crowbar to his saddle. Night fell heavy as a blanket. He mounted the steady drum of hooves carrying him home. That night the wind shifted. No rain fell, but its scent clung under the eaves. In the yard, a lantern swayed lightly, spilling a golden circle across the porch. Samuel sat on the steps, his revolver cleaned and sheathed. He did not play his harmonica, yet somewhere beyond the grass, a thin tune rose and faded, like memory itself speaking. From the tree line came a heavy step, soft, so soft the neighbor's old hound didn't stir. Samuel left the lantern dark. He let his eyes find the shapes in shadow. On the fence near the gate, a faint X of fresh earth appeared, so pale only those who knew to look would see. Protection, Samuel thought. The boundary had been rewritten in an older tongue. Days after the forest itself shifted, deer no longer crossed his yard, they skirted wide. Rabbits left his corn patch alone. Coyotes chose a different creek. And once, when a gang of town boys rode out to cut fence and rustle a few head, they stopped cold at the third post, muttered, then turned their horses back. No explanation, no whispers. In this country, some barriers needed no guns. On a Saturday evening, old Kruger from the valley drove by, reining up to peer across the ridge. "Hear tell something's stirring up here," he said, voice easy, as if asking after the weather. "You seen anything?" Samuel poured coffee from the pot, handed him a cup, poured one for himself. "Just the wind," he said. Their eyes held for half a beat. Kruger nodded, drank, and asked no more. In the West, silence was the highest form of respect. That night, Samuel set 2 small branch X's on his windowsill, not for superstition, but for memory. To remember the bow in the forest, the hand laid on his chest, the promise without words, yet impossible to forget. He sat by the fire, feeding pine to the flames, resin's warmth filling his lungs. Outside, a step passed lightly, pausing a beat before his door, then slipped away like mist. A man could live alone all his life and belong to nothing, but sometimes one X laid in the right place was enough to give him a home. And that home was a forest that kept its silence for him. The deepest emotional stories in the end need no words. They only need one man to stand in the right place at the right time and not draw his hand back when it comes time to tie the knot for another. Before dousing the lamp, Samuel scrawled a line on a folded scrap of paper. Don't fear what you don't understand. Fear forgetting who you owe. Beneath it, he drew a small, dark X. He tucked it into his breast pocket. If one night someone left an X at your doorstep, no note, no voice, would you keep it as a shield or erase it to spare yourself the town's suspicion? Tell me, what would you do? A new boundary morning mist rolled thick over the British Columbia range, silver as a veil. Dew clung to the fresh grass while sunlight slipped between the mountains, painting long, slanted beams across the prairie. Samuel Carter's old ranch stood quiet, the wind humming through the wooden fence like a familiar low tune. In recent days, the forest had changed. Deer that once roamed the fields had vanished. The wolves no longer howled near the edge of the grass. Even the nightbirds chose paths further away. Nothing dared cross this land anymore, except for the unseen eyes that watched from the deep woods. But their gaze was not a threat. It was present, steady, silent, a message that Samuel was no longer alone. By late afternoon, Samuel stood on the porch. The wooden beams groaned under the wind firelight from inside, glinting off eyes aged but unyielding. He leaned against the post, staring into the dark wall of trees. Branches swayed, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw it, a towering figure, amber eyes burning through the mist. Samuel said nothing. He only nodded once. A small gesture, yet it carried everything he meant to send: a greeting, a thank you, and an unspoken pact. The wind swept across the yard, snapping brittle grass, whispering through the horse stalls like a reply. Samuel smiled faintly, a rare smile, quiet, shared only with the wind and the woods. He turned back inside. Behind him, the forest sank into night. But in that darkness, there was no longer menace. It had become a boundary reborn, a place where Samuel belonged, where nature itself had taken him into its silent order. On the wooden table, his old revolver lay, polished steel, reflecting firelight. But Samuel knew some battles are not won with bullets. Sometimes all it takes is a stone moved, a nod exchanged, or an X carved in the dirt to change a man's fate forever. Sometimes saving a life doesn't just change theirs. It changes your whole world. Do you believe there are bonds that reach beyond the language of men? And if you were the rancher, would you have stayed or ridden away into the wild? Let me know in the comments.